Hey guys, welcome back to Mr. Nell's Social 9 podcast. This is Chapter 4, Episode 3, and this chapter will be focusing on the Indian Act. So quick recap, Chapter 4 is all about collective rights, which are specific rights given to specific groups of people. This chapter is going to focus on First Nations, Métis, Inuit, Francophones, which are French-speaking Canadians, and Anglophones, but for the most part we got First Nations and Francophones. This episode mostly focusing on the Indian Act. So, starting off, what exactly is the Indian Act? And if you're following along in the textbook, this is right on page 137. For the most part, I'll be going through the PowerPoint slides and reading a little bit of stories as well, like always. So, what is the Indian Act? So far, this chapter has explored the collective rights of First Nations in the numbered treaties. That was last episode. This exploration mentioned the Indian Act because the Indian Act demonstrated something important about the ways Canada's government understood treaty rights. This page that I'm on right now, which is 137, and the next few examine the Indian Act in more depth. So the big thing here is the relationship between the government and First Nations at the time. We went through the timeline there. It started off really good, got really bad, and then it's slowly starting to go back up again. But the idea of the Indian Act, at the beginning at least, was the government trying to help, but just did not do the right thing. So the numbered treaties confirmed the Canadian government's duty to protect the collective rights of First Nations. The Indian Act was one way the government attempted to do this. So one way they attempted to protect the collective rights of First Nations. Under the Act, the federal government is able to develop specific policies and programs to administer treaty rights to First Nations. The Act did affirm the collective rights of First Nations. It also created officials for each reserve, called Indian agents, with the power to decide individually how the government would fulfill its duties. This meant there were many interpretations of what treaty rights meant on a case-by-case basis. So the treaties were, again, from First Nations' perspective, these binding sacred agreements between nations, and the government basically put their own people, called Indian agents, they were their own people, in charge of all the reserves, and they themselves could decide how to interpret the treaties. The Indian Act dates from 1876. At the time, Canada's government thought it appropriate to make laws for First Nations without consulting them. This connects to Canada's colonial past, when people of European descent believed their culture superior to all other cultures. That's that word, ethnocentrism, the belief that one's culture is superior to all other cultures. So it wasn't so much them purposely being mean specifically to the First Nations, it was just they thought they were better than all of them, every culture. The Act defines who may be registered as a status Indian with treaty rights. This means the federal government mostly controls these decisions, not First Nations themselves. The Indian Act was and is a way for the government to administer treaty rights for treaty peoples. The Act originally aimed to assimilate First Nations people. That was the main goal when the government first decided to pass this Indian Act. Assimilate meaning become part of a different cultural group. So hopefully the plan was for the First Nations to be assimilated into, at the time, European culture and forget about their own culture. It defined how First Nations people had to conduct their affairs, such as banned elections, although First Nations had their own ways of governing themselves. So you can kind of see here, at the time of this Indian Act, in the 1870s, the government was like, yeah, we're gonna work together with these treaty rights, but we're not really gonna work together. We're gonna basically be in charge of everything, and not ask you any of your opinions at all. So it's not going well right now at this time in the 1870s. At points in history, the Act restricted the right of First Nations people to travel freely, to take political action, to wear traditional dress, and to take part in traditional ceremonies. So right now this act is kind of going one way completely. You can see why the relationship between First Nations and the government soured so massively throughout history. It wasn't until the 1960s the act required First Nations people to give up their legal identity and treaty rights to gain the right to vote. So in the 1960s, the government said, you basically have to give up saying that you're First Nation if you want to gain the right to vote, and you'll lose your treaty rights as well. Pressure from First Nation, excuse me, pressure from First Nations has caused Canada's government to revise the Indian Act several times. The Act still remains in force to this day. It's just been amended numerous times throughout the years. So now I'm on page 138, if you're following along. Excuse me. Changing the Indian Act. First Nations and Canada's government agree that the Indian Act needs updating. But First Nations rejected the government's attempt in 2002. So, in 2002 was one of the last times they attempted to amend the bill. But the First Nations rejected the government's ideas at the time. And so we're going to read this little article here about that. Ottawa has unveiled legislation to replace the Indian Act, Bill C-61, the First Nations Governance Act. This legislation puts the power to handle community governance affairs where it belongs, in the hands of First Nations people themselves, said Indian Affairs Minister. Many First Nations say the government did not consult them adequately before drafting the bill. They reject the bill in principle because it does not recognize their status as nations with the right to make rules for themselves. Among its many measures, the First Nations Governance Act would establish codes of conduct for First Nations officials and require First Nations to prepare budgets for public review. As well, it would allow First Nations to make bylaws for their reserves. Bylaws would be like laws that are only enforced within their own reserves. Assembly of First Nations Grand Chief ripped up the bill in full view of hundreds of First Nations protesters on Parliament Hill. He called the bill the Indian Act Part 2. I believe that we as First Nations have a right to determine our own political institutions, to establish our own political societies. We are not children. We can manage, coordinate, administer, and run our own affairs. He described the bill as a new form of colonialism. It's little more than a new rule book, she says. They say the bill is needed because a 126-year-old Indian Act is outdated. So, this was 2002, so we got a while back here. But the government, you always want to see both sides here. So clearly, First Nations did not like this new updated bill. Not consulted enough again, and again, this is 2002. This is not that long ago, and but it was an attempt by the government to give more back, but they ripped it up anyways. So that's kind of your brief little history on the Indian Act. It is still going on today, obviously again with amendments and updates throughout the years. Now we're going to focus a little bit more, getting out of the Indian Act side and going more towards Francophones, which are French-speaking Canadians. So right now I'm on page 141, but it says, what collective rights do official language groups have under the Charter? So official language groups, English and French. Those are the two official languages of Canada. Mostly focusing on Francophones right now, though. So, page 142. We got sections 16 to 20 of the Charter establish French and English as official languages in Canada, and the right of Canadian citizens to conduct their affairs with federal government in either official language. So any discussion you have with the federal government in any way could be done in English or French. These sections also established New Brunswick as an officially bilingual province. Bilingual meaning two languages, English and French. So, what are official language minorities? On page 143 and 144, we'll go over that in a second, but it basically presents an interview with a Francophone student from Alberta, followed by an interview with an Anglophone student living in Quebec. So you got a French-speaking student living in Alberta, and then another interview with an English-speaking student living in Quebec. And we'll talk about their different experiences that they went through. If you're also taking a look at page 142, there's a map. I should have put it on the presentation here, but it kind of shows you a breakdown based on 2001. It's probably roughly the same still. We got majority English speaking, majority French speaking, majority Inuit speaking, and English is the majority spoken language all over Canada, except for in Nunavut and Quebec. So English everywhere else is the majority spoken language. So when we talk about minority language in this chapter, with regards to collective rights, minority means like less than half. So we're not talking about like minority government, although it kind of relates. But in Fox Creek, for example, the majority spoken language is English. Anything else is a minority. So on page 143, we have the first story, which is the French-speaking student living in Alberta. Her name's Rachel, and this goes with one of your smaller assignments that's on the screen right now. Rachel St. Laurent is a grade 10 student at École Héritage, a Francophone school in Falher, Alberta. I've actually played against them in sports before. It was established in 1988 because of Section 23 rights in Canada's Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Rachel lives in St. Isidore, a Francophone community near Peace River. Francophones in Alberta belong to one of Canada's official language minorities, because Alberta is majority speaking English, so French is in the minority spoken languages. So here's her story. I've attended a Francophone school ever since I was in kindergarten. My whole family is Francophone. I think it's important to go to a Francophone school because it shows my community that I'm really trying to be involved in French. I want to keep my French language my whole life and to pass it on to my kids. I think it's important both for myself and for my community to keep my French and to show it off. It shows people that everybody's different and nobody's better than somebody else just because they speak another language. French is the first language for just about everybody in St. Isidore. When I'm done with school, I'm planning to become a hairdresser. My friends and I want to own our own company, so it will be really useful to speak both French and English. I feel lucky to be bilingual. I sometimes worry about losing my French. It takes effort to speak French in everyday life, because in Alberta, almost everyone speaks English. So, it's odd for some people to think of the idea of losing your language. But just brief personal story, my dad only spoke French when he was born. Complete Francophone, born in Sudbury, Ontario, went to a French school, elementary school, and then went to an English high school. My dad can't speak French anymore at all. He's completely lost it, and he was born only speaking French. So it is possible to almost completely lose a language. So still on page 143, what's a Francophone school? Rachel's school, École Héritage, is one of 26 Francophone schools in Alberta. So right now we have 26. Francophone schools and school boards are a right of Alberta Francophone minorities under Section 23 of Canada's Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Just as Anglophone schools are a right of the Anglophone community in Quebec. Francophone schools provide instruction for Francophone students whose first language is French. They are different from French immersion schools, which teach French to students whose first language is English. So there's a difference there. Francophone schools, first language French students. French immersion schools are ones where they put a heavy emphasis on learning French, but the students are still first language English. And now I'm on page 144, which is the second kid story of the student who is English, Anglophone, living in Quebec. Devin is an English-speaking student who attends Quebec High School in the city of Quebec. Quebec High School is one of many schools in the province of Quebec that provides education for Anglophones. Like Francophone schools in Alberta, Devin School comes from the right of Anglophones in Quebec as an official language minority. Here's his story. I'm bilingual, but English is my first language. I'm a lot more comfortable in English. My family speaks English at home. I feel it's important for me to attend an English school because English is my mother tongue. Mother tongue, another word for first language. I feel like I should be educated in my first language. Also, English is the language that has the most possibilities in the field I want to go into later in life. I want to work in the sciences, and that's mostly in English. I think my life is similar to students who live in places where English is the majority language. The biggest difference is probably everyday stuff, like having to know French terms at the grocery store. Outside of school and at home, I have to speak French most of the time. For example, I'm on a baseball team and every one of my teammates is Francophone. I don't worry about losing my identity living in Quebec. If anything, living here makes my Anglophone identity stronger because there aren't many of us here. In the city of Quebec, less than 5% of people are Anglophones. You're more aware of the fact that you're an English-speaking person when you're in a French-speaking society. So two vastly different experiences from two different people living across the country. And your answers are, your assignments there, it's a small one, just kind of going through the stories again on your own or listening to this episode. Page 145, we're talking about a little bit more about official language groups in Canada. Again, Francophone, Anglophone, get that in your head. Official bilingualism. Section 16 to 20 of the Charter establishes French and English as official languages in Canada, and the right of Canadian citizens to conduct their affairs in either language. We already went through this. Again, if you are talking to the federal government in any way, you have the right to talk in English or French. Minority language rights. Again, Section 23, that keeps getting brought up more and more and more, says that French-speaking or English-speaking minority populations of sufficient size in any province has the right to publicly funded schools that serve their language community. That's a big one. Read that one more time. That's on page 145. Section 23 of the Charter says that a French-speaking or English-speaking minority population of sufficient size in any province has the right to a publicly funded school that serve their language community. So, for example, if for some reason hundreds of French-speaking Francophone Canadians moved to Fox Creek, they would, by law, under our charter, have to be provided a school, a Francophone school. But it clearly says sufficient size. Moving on to page 146, how has the Charter affected Francophone education? So, rights for Francophones and Anglophones are part of what made Confederation, and so Canada, possible. Under the British North American Act, BNA Act, Confederation established Canada as a bicultural, bilingual country with rights for Francophones and Anglophones. It made French and English official languages of Canada's Parliament. It guaranteed public schools for the Protestant minority in Quebec and the Catholic minorities in the rest of Canada. The rest of Canada at the time, by the way, this is in the 1867, included Ontario, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick. These religion-based rights corresponded to English-French language divisions in Canada at the time, since most Protestants spoke English and most Catholics spoke French. Nowadays, it's not separated in any way by religion. It's separated just basically purely on, do you speak English as a first language or do you speak French as a first language? So some fun facts here on page 147. Did you know Confederation established Canada as a bilingual, bicultural country with education rights for Protestants and Catholics? But for many years, the equality of Francophones and Anglophones was more of an ideal than a reality, especially for Francophones in minority settings. In what way did the following acts and resolutions draw the founding principles of Confederation into question? In 1890, we had a Manitoba Schools Act. Manitoba entered Confederation in 1870 as a bilingual province with rights to publicly funded Catholic schools that served the Francophone community and Protestant schools that served the Anglophone community. Although these rights have been hard won by Louis Riel and central to the entry of Manitoba into Confederation, the Manitoba School Act, 1, abolished public funding for Catholic schools, 2, made Manitoba an officially English-only province. In the 1890s. 1892, the resolution in Northwest Territories, Ordinance Number 22. Before Alberta became a province, it was part of the Northwest Territories, which was officially bilingual and had publicly funded Catholic schools and Protestant schools. So again, at this time, it's separated based on religion because almost all French-speaking people were Catholic and almost all Protestants were English. That's basically why. The Hultian resolution was proposed by the premier of the territory and passed by the Territory Assembly. It called for the proceedings of the Assembly to be English only. So in 1892, so this amazing country, amazing confederation at the time, basically saying Canada is officially bilingual, and we have all these individual provinces, or at this time territories, making up their own rules. So Manitoba going English only, and now all of a sudden the act called Ordinance 22 basically said English only in schools and English only in their parliament. So not good right now for any Francophones. This is just a did you know though. This is all changed now, obviously. And really important here to go through. Sorry, this is a super long episode, but we'll go through it together. This is a decent sized chapter, but we'll go through it pretty quickly. So the Charter and Francophone education rights in Alberta, just a helpful little picture here to summarize this episode. So in 1982, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms becomes part of Canada's Constitution. Huge. How did it affect Francophone schools? So just a year later. I'm on the left side right now. Francophone parents begin to lobby for their minority language education rights under Section 23 of the Charter, basically right away. In 1984, Alberta's first 2 publicly funded Francophone schools opened in Edmonton and Calgary. Present, Alberta has 26 publicly funded Francophone schools. On the right side there, how did it affect the boards? Again, Francophone parents in Alberta launched a charter challenge. So they took Alberta to court to establish their right to Francophone school boards. In 1990, so it took a while here. We got 1983 to 1990. The Supreme Court affirmed the right. It means like they won. They won in court. And present, across Canada, Francophones outside of Quebec have established more than 25 school boards, including 5 in Alberta. School board is we're Northern Gateway, so a school board is made up of a bunch of individual schools. So you can see this, this chapter connects right with chapter 3 in the Charter of Rights. And I think this is the last part here. Yep. Bill 101. You really, really want to understand Bill 101 and the effect that it had. So 1977, Bill 101. This Quebec law set down the rules for protecting and promoting the use of the French language in Quebec. It states these reasons. So they're right here. French-speaking people are a distinct people, and French is the language that expresses their identity. The people of Quebec want to make French the language of government and the everyday language of work, education, and business. So, before the Charter existed, because we're going back here again, 1982 is when the Charter of Rights and Freedoms came out. 1977 is Quebec basically trying to make Quebec all French. So before the Charter, The rule was commercial signs may use only French. Any signs in the entire province had to only be French. Okay? That was one of the rules they had in 1977. So then the charter comes out. 1982, freedom of expression. Anglophone businesses seek the right to use English on signs. So we have a charter challenge here. Anglophone communities in Quebec are saying, whoa, 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 Bill 101, says this, but now the charter exists, so we actually want to put English on our signs. 1988, Supreme Court decision. The law can require signs to use French, but cannot prohibit the use of English in addition. The law can require French to be more prominent than English. So it's kind of a weird little compromise here. So the law could say, yes, they must be in French, but if a company wanted to put English on there as well, they could, but it had to be smaller. So kind of a compromise there. And then again, so another part of the Bill 101, Francophones and immigrants in Quebec must attend Francophone schools. So if you were born French or you moved from another country to Quebec, you have to go to a Francophone school, a French school. This is Bill 101, so before the charter. So what happened after the charter? Equality rights. Francophone and immigrant parents in Quebec seek the right to educate their children in English. So this is parents and immigrants saying we have the right to choose our own religion, we have the right to our own freedom of expression, our own equality rights. Like why can we not go to an English school? So this would be a French family decides they want to put their kid into an English-speaking, an Anglophone school in Quebec, where they would not be allowed. Now the charter exists. Let's see what happened. 2005. So way after the charter. Supreme Court decision. Francophone parents do not have a right to educate their children in Anglophone schools in Quebec, since this violates the intent of Section 23 to protect Francophone identity as a minority culture in Canada. Immigrant parents, however, do have this right if their children have already received some education in English. So, they kind of lost. If you are born in Quebec to a French family, you must go to a French school. No choice. Because they're basically saying Section 23 supersedes the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So, this is only my opinion here. The fear would be if too many people started doing this, the French language would slowly die, which is actually happening. But for immigrants, however, it does say if you were already taught in English at some point in your life before you decided to immigrate to Canada, you can go to an Anglophone English-speaking school in Quebec. Okay, that was a lot. That was a long episode, guys. Thanks a lot for sticking around. Next episode, we're going to talk about the Métis and their timeline of their collective rights. Okay, have a great day. See you next time.